Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another conversation in our CBF Conversation series. We're glad you've joined us again today. We're excited to bring you stories from folks doing work to renew God's world from across the fellowship. I'm your host, Stephen Reeves, Associate Coordinator for Advocacy for the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship. And this week, we'll be having a conversation about the intersection of missions and advocacy. And we're excited to bring a number of our field personnel to you this afternoon to talk about that. This is another in our long-running series now of CBF Conversations, and this is live and recorded video discussions of faith and culture topics for the benefit of Christians and congregations. You can find recordings of the previous conversations and the schedule of upcoming conversations at cbf.net/conversations. And before we get into our conversation today, I want you to know that you have the opportunity to ask questions of our panelists. If you're on Facebook, comment in the panel on the right, and we'll attempt to do our best to get to some of those questions. I can't promise we're going to get to all of them today, but we'll do our best. This afternoon's conversation is the fourth in a series of conversations about advocacy and the local church. And it is in support of and in conjunction with the release of this book, The Mission of Advocacy, a Toolkit for Congregations. That's available now. And this book helps churches, congregations, and pastors think more deeply about how their own voice and influence can impact the communities in which they serve. And so for CBF, our commitment to advocacy is rooted fully in our mission commitments. And that goes from the local church and their work in the community, but also our field personnel serving here at home and around the globe. And so we want to dig in this afternoon and hear from our field personnel and hear their story and their ministry and how advocacy has become a part of their work. And so I want to introduce them to you right now. First, we have Angel Pittman in Miami, Florida. Hey, Angel, how you doing?
I'm great. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. Angel has recently made a transition to educational advocate for CBF after serving many, many years with Touching Miami with Love, a long-time CBF organization there in Florida and doing amazing, great work. So, Angel, thank you for being with us.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Scarlett Jasper is here as well. Scarlett leads Olive Branch Ministries in rural South Central Kentucky. And so Scarlett has been a part of a number of our advocacy efforts, particularly around predatory lending, payday and auto title lending. Scarlett, thank you for being here today.
I'm glad to be here.
Look forward to hearing from you. And then last but not least, we're lucky to have both Greg and Sue Smith with us here today. How are y'all?
Doing great.
We're good.
Thank you.
Thanks for being with us. Greg and Sue serve and lead Lucha Ministries in Fredericksburg, Virginia, in Northern Virginia, in a predominantly immigrant community there. And so we look forward to hearing from you all and stories of your ministry this afternoon. We have three very different contexts and three sort of primary issue areas that have been important for CBF and for our supporters. You know, one of the most important things CBF Advocacy is trying to do is encourage and teach advocacy at the local level, in the local congregation. And again, basing that on the mission commitments and experience that the church has in the community. But as a national organization, we also want to model and kind of show advocacy ourselves on behalf of CBF. And in doing so, we're really rooting it in the experience of our field personnel like these we have with us. And so Greg and Sue Smith encounter issues around immigration on a daily basis. As I said, Scarlett is often faced with helping those who find themselves in a debt trap loan of payday lending. And Angel, as I mentioned, is in public education. These are three areas where we have seen some broad consensus across CBF life where folks have really cared and want to get engaged. And so as we start this conversation, I'd like to hear a little bit more from each of you all about the community in which you serve and some of the main things you do. And so, Scarlett, if you wouldn't mind, we'll start with you. Tell us about Olive Branch Ministries and what you do there in Kentucky.
All right. Yes, I serve in South Central, Southeastern Kentucky, and currently in Scott County, Tennessee as well. So these are our rural communities, which are part of our Together for Hope initiative. So what we face is rural poverty and a lot of generational poverty. So it's been going on for a very long time. These are persistent poverty communities. So they're just prime feeding ground for predatory lenders. So we often encounter that. Some of my areas, there'll be as many as 3 or 4 of these type of businesses within a mile radius. So you always know that you are in an area that is struggling with economic issues when you start seeing a lot of these businesses. So, that's pretty much the area that I serve in is rural poverty, generational poverty, and, working with folks that are just struggling with a lot of issues. Financial literacy has always been a large part of my work, even prior to coming to CBF. So it's a large part of what I do.
Great. Thank you, Scarlett. Angel, tell us a little bit more about your context there in Miami.
Yeah, so I'm a little different. I am in a very urban area of Miami. I live and primarily work out of Overtown, which is a neighborhood adjacent to downtown Miami. It is the historic African American community in our city. And like you mentioned, for 15 years, I served at Touching Miami with Love with a focus on holistic programming for children. And so just like we'll talk about today, from those experiences, I sort of backed up into advocacy in seeing situations. And so that's where I find myself today, serving in a broader sense for not only the schools in need in my area, but then across the state, and then helping to support others who are doing educational ministry across the country in CBF Life.
Great, thank you. We're excited about that new part of your journey, Angel. So,
thank you.
Sue, how about we'll go with you just to explain the context you guys find yourself in.
Well, I guess we're kind of between Angel and Scarlett because we're kind of in a suburban area. We're 50 miles out of DC, so kind of a bedroom community. A lot of the immigrants that we have in our area are from Central and South America, Mexico. And so most of our ministry is in Spanish, dealing with a lot of the felt human needs of these folks. I'm actually a social worker, and so I focus a whole lot on more of a direct form of advocacy of helping people and empowering people to do things for themselves and to engage with agencies and to locate resources within the community.
Great. Greg, how about you? What's your role there?
For the last 5 or 6 years, my role has been as program director of the Immigration and Legal Services program that we have with Lucha Ministries. So the context that I'm involved in is with immigrants, refugees, asylees, and others who are looking for an immigration benefit, who qualify for an immigration benefit, not only within the Hispanic community or Spanish language community, but really with any community, immigrant community that is seeking an immigration benefit, whether to adjust status or some other type of benefit. So we work with them as a recognized organization, and I'm an accredited representative through the Department of Justice.
That's great. We're excited about both you all. What a great team when you have a social worker and someone providing legal services. That's a pretty good 1-2 there. Sue, I want to touch on something you said earlier, and that is, when we first started talking about advocacy within CBF, it was sort of a new term. Prior to 2013, when I came on board, we didn't have kind of an organized advocacy effort at the national office. But you guys have been advocates for way longer than that. And in some ways that it is sometimes individual. So advocacy can be both in an individual sense and in a systemic sense. And so I think it's important for folks to think about that and realize that when we talk about advocacy. And I was writing this book along with Reverend Katie Ferguson Murray, who was at the time serving at Wilshire Baptist Church in Dallas. we were thinking about, how a congregation might root itself in mission to begin advocacy. And I thought more and more about that. And I realized not only do I think we should root our advocacy and our mission work, but there's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of commonality between these two sort of fields that may seem different for folks. And so I want to mention a few that I thought of that are in the book, and get your kind of reaction and response and see if there's anything else you would add. The first thing about advocacy that I think also is true of mission is committing to a long-term presence. You guys have certainly done that. So Angel, you've been 15 plus years. Greg and Sue, how long have you been there at Lucha?
2004 with Lucha Ministries.
Okay, so going on 16 years. And Scarlett, how about you? How long have you been in that community?
I've been doing similar type work in this community for over 30 years.
That's long-term presence. That is not fly-by-night, weekend, short-term mission work. And I think for me, that's a incredible hallmark of CBF's mission work, that we really do commit. I think it makes for better mission. And I think that same dedication makes for better advocacy work. We can't expect to work and fight for systemic changes and think it's going to happen in a weekend or maybe even in a year, that this is a long-term commitment. And so, I have experience in Texas, and our legislature doesn't even meet every year. We meet every other year. So this can take a long time to see the changes come about when it comes to advocacy. Another similar point, I think, is learning the language. Obviously, Greg and Sue, you all learned Spanish many years ago now, correct?
Mm-hmm. Right.
But there was a process. You weren't going to be effective until you learned that language. I think in some ways it's similar in advocacy, that there can be technical terms, there can be legislative or congressional sort of vocabulary that you have to get a hold of and understand in order to be an effective advocate. A lot of times that comes in economics. People will talk, when it comes to advocacy, you're often talking about economics and taxation and that sort of thing. And so I think to be a good advocate, just like a good field personnel or missionary, oftentimes you have to learn a different language. You have to embrace service beyond the church. You guys are obviously in congregations, plenty, often, but your primary work is not in the congregations, it's outside the congregation, in the community. When I go and advocate in Washington or meet with coalitions, I'm certainly outside the typical four walls of the church, and I'm often meeting with folks who don't know who CBF is or don't know about our congregations and churches. And so it's different than kind of vocational ministry in a church setting, for sure. Obviously, you want to bear witness to Jesus Christ. And I'll say you all do that extraordinarily well just by the love and commitment you show these communities. And sometimes that's explicit, and sometimes that's by your life and what you do there. And I think I've been surprised in my work in advocacy how sometimes advocates end up being chaplains. Sometimes people want to hear your motivation. What is it in your life? How, as a Christian, are you here? What is it that's bringing you to this spot? And so you can bear witness to Jesus Christ in sort of a way that may be unexpected. The next thing I said that's important for both is checking your ego. Obviously, none of us are the savior. We have a savior, and it's not us. We're not going to save the world. And so sometimes I think it's tempting in both mission work and advocacy work to sort of get puffed up a little bit, that you're here to save things. And when it comes to advocacy, sometimes you can get close to power. And sometimes that's tempting, and sometimes that can really kind of challenge your ego. And so that was something else I thought of as being kind of a commonality. And finally, I said we ought to practice a form of asset-based community development. And this is another kind of hallmark of CBF advocacy or CBF mission work, where we don't go in, automatically telling people what they need. We go in to listen to the community and find the resources there that can help. And I think similarly in advocacy, sometimes we think we know all the right answers before we really have talked to the folks who are facing the problem. And so that's another way that I think advocacy and mission work, the line can be really thin. And some of the same things that make for good advocacy make for good mission work, and vice versa. And so I'd love to hear you all reflect on any of those, or challenge me, or any other ideas you have about those, how those things are similar.
Well, I'll jump in, Stephen. I think for us, the long-term presence has been specifically important. We came out of 12 years of working in Latin America, moved back to the States, and began working with Latino immigrants here in the U.S. And our deep understanding of language and culture helped a lot. Mm-hmm. But we didn't know really the stories of folks who have come here. And so we began just to walk alongside people. And by jumping into that kind of social worker role and helping people with resources, and we learned their stories, and we learned the experiences that they have, and we saw the places where we need improvement in our country. And I think that was the jumping off point for us, is because we engage with people over the long haul, whether it's accompanying people to medical appointments, or just knowing our community well enough to know where to make a referral, or who is going to be referred to us for a specific need. And I think that's really, really important part of that long-term presence, is really knowing the people and caring about the people that you want to help.
Great. Absolutely. Anybody else have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I wanted to just echo that as well. It's that long-term presence and the relationships, because as you do this type of work, like Sue was referring to, of kind of social work type of work, of helping people and referring to agencies and other resources, you build those relationships to where you can build that trust, to where they're willing to share with you. And that's, how my work in the financial literacy aspect got started, was getting to know families and getting, to know that then they get to where they're willing to share that very private part of finances with you. And then you begin to learn and see where families were being taken advantage of by, these predatory lenders, that we advocate against. But, being able to share that story, then having that relationship and trust with you to be able to share that with you is a huge step. So that it's that presence and building the relationships and walking with the families that you're working with, and just walking with them. And when we're talking about the asset-based community development, that is just essential in the work that I do, and working with communities and seeing, the gifts that they have. My communities have so many resources in the people. So getting to know those and building those relationships and identifying that and seeing how we can work together, is just vital part of my work, for sure.
Great. Thank you, Scarlett.
Yeah, and I don't know of a field personnel or somebody who is, serving, who doesn't have a side to their work that's advocacy, because you don't enter into relationships with people who have struggles and pain and walk away and go, well, that's solved. It's, it's life. There's continuing struggles, and you enter into those relationships, like Scarlett says, and, together you work through them. And so if you have been further down the road, or, seen situations similar, you want to share that information, and you want to give, the right pointers. And oftentimes that means that, you're joining with them in advocating for themselves. So it's just the next step, I think, when you're serving alongside people.
Thanks, Angel.
Yeah. And relationships, as you said, Stephen, require learning the language of the people that you work with. But it's not just simply learning the language of the people, as well as learning the language of the work that you do. And I have grown in my appreciation for the legal profession that you are trained in, and others are trained in. It is an incredibly difficult language to learn, which I have only begun to learn a little bit about and learn a little bit of, especially with help. We have a volunteer immigration attorney that works with us, and so he has taught me a tremendous amount. But you don't just learn the language to be learning the language, whatever that is. You learn the language in order to minister. You learn the language in order to serve. You learn the language in order to advocate. And so part of advocacy, I think, is helping others understand, helping others see what they need to see and understand what they need to understand. And if you don't understand it, if you're not immersed in it, if you haven't grasped it, you can't communicate it. And so advocacy, part of advocacy is helping people to know what they need to know, and to share that knowledge as best as you can, and then obviously learn from them as well as they as you experience and continue that relationship.
Well, thank you for that, Greg. There's a reason why in your first year of law school, you've got the case book in front of you and a Black's Law Dictionary right next to you at all times, because it is like learning new language. But let me say, I have full confidence in the language of immigration law way better than I do. And what little I know is extremely complex. It's only maybe like tax law is the only thing I can equate it to. It's very complex. And so we're grateful for the fact that you've learned that and serve in that way. Two words stuck out to me that when you all answered. One was story and one was trust. And those are really critically important. And, there's only a few ways that policy is often moved, right? Votes, obviously, massive people voting one way or another, different directions. Money, contributions, lobbyists, that sort of thing. But I still believe that the right story told by the right person at the right time to the right person can make a serious impact, especially when you couple that with the fact that you all are hearing these stories firsthand. And we have a moral conviction about us. This work is rooted in our faith. And I'll also say to Greg, to your point too, I think when we can help folks know when and how to use their own voice, that's when we have the most impact. And so it's not easy. Sometimes I hear friends talk about they want to be a voice for the voiceless, which I totally affirm that the biblical root of that. And certainly that's something different than self-interest, right? That's on behalf of others. But people have voices. Almost everyone has a voice. The problem is they're too often ignored or silenced. And so I think the best advocacy work, and I've seen you all do it, is when you can bring their voice to the table. So thank you all for reflecting on that. I'd like to hear from each of you now about maybe your journey. I don't know if any of you, you can raise your hand, but if you thought of, I'm going to go to be a field personnel because I want to go into advocacy. Was that kind of, probably not exactly maybe what you had in mind, but yet, as Angel said, you it comes together, and now you all have each found yourself in a place where I would say your ministry includes a good bit of advocacy. So I'd like to hear each of you all talk about that journey for you, from how the missions to advocacy journey work in your own ministry. And Scarlett, if you don't mind, we'll start with you.
Okay. My advocacy journey really started with my son. He was diagnosed with dyslexia. And so my advocacy journey began in the educational realm of advocating for my child who, needed that. And as a parent, I learned those statutes and all of those things that were relevant to what I needed to help my child. And so started there and advocating for other children and helped to start a nonprofit for children with learning disabilities. And so that's where my advocacy journey started. And it just always kind of been part of my work in different realms. I also worked for a domestic violence shelter. So I learned to advocate, became a certified domestic violence advocate for women who were survivors of domestic abuse. And then through that work is how I got involved in the financial literacy work that is a large part of my ministry now. So in that work, I started advocating, like I said, long before being fortunate enough to be involved with CBF and become field personnel, it was already part of my journey prior to coming. So I didn't start out to say I'm going to be an advocate, but within our work and the work that I've done over the years, it has been a large part of my work in various fields. So it's something that I'm thankful that I'm able to do, and will continue. And we can all be advocates. Is the one thing that we all can be, and we all are, if we choose to do that. We can all use our voice.
Well, thank you, Scarlett. Your advocacy around payday lending and predatory lending issues has been powerful and very helpful when it comes to our advocacy as a national organization. And so thank you for that, for your willingness. Sometimes, again, people feel like there's some sort of line that they don't want to cross into. And so, but you've shown when you love this community, you do what you got to do, and that includes advocacy. So, Angel, how about you? You've gone especially had a especially different journey. Now becoming more of what you do full time. But tell us how you got here a little more.
Yeah, I think similar to Scarlett, for a lot of us parents, our parenthood is our first foray into advocacy. Mine is a little bit different. I've raised my kids in the neighborhood that my husband Jason and I have served in, and that meant that my children were raised in Touching Miami's Loves Ministries, and so they were friends with other kids in the community. And then those kids would hear about opportunities or things that my children were involved in, and would ask me, hey, can I do that too? And one of the most poignant moments for me that was really a wake-up call was when my now 21-year-old son was in middle school. He was very good friends with a young man, same age, same grade, and they were talking about where they were going to go to high school. And my son had chosen a merit-based public school in our area. And so Zay came to me and said, hey, I heard Isaac's going to this school. I want to go to that school too. And I said, oh, that'd be great. They've grown up together. They're good friends. This would be great for him to go to this magnet program as well. And then as we started filling out the application for him, and I contacted his mom, and she said, yeah, if you can help us with that, that would be great. So we started filling out the application and found out that he did not have the classes that were required prerequisites. Well, then as we dug deeper, found out the school does not offer those classes. And so I had to break the news to him that he could not go to the school that was just blocks from our neighborhood, that his good friend Isaac was going to through no fault of his own. And so that bothered me deeply. And I just thought, something's not right. And so when you talk about telling a story at the right time to the right people, well, it wasn't too long after that our superintendent hosted these community coffee times. And so I made sure that I was there early, and I sat in the front row, and I brought it up and said, do you know that this school in this community is cut off from this amazing opportunity? And we went back and forth, and he said, no, that can't be true. And then he said, you know what, I'll check into that. And following up, and it was the next school year that they offered that. But this was something that as a parent, I knew, you want to give the best for your child. And there was obviously an inequity. And so I thought, okay, I'd seen enough of similar stories with other kids at Touching Mind with Love, but this one hit really close to home. And I knew, okay, I've got to be a part of making things fair and equitable for kids. So.
Well, that's great. We're really blessed with a lot of passion around education for public education, or advocacy for public education in CBF Life. And so, I don't know if you can put up a chat to your resource you recently created. Maybe I can try and find that. But Angel's done some great work already, kind of explaining some of the issues and why Christians and churches ought to be involved. And so we're grateful for that. Angel works some with pastors for Florida children, and we've got Pastors for Texas Children. The Pastors for Children Network is something I really encourage folks to look into, which kind of takes that the ministry at the local public schools and includes advocacy for it. And so we're grateful for their partnership and for your work that you've already done.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, Greg, what about you? I'll let you start this time. We'll go Smith to Smith this time. Greg,
Okay.
and tell us about how this is advocacy has become more a part of your work there.
Well, as Sue said, that we served 12 years in Latin America, in Costa Rica primarily, and I don't believe that I ever really thought of myself as an advocate there. Just really never. It was not a word or not a concept that I used or understood really in our service there. But when we came back from Costa Rica, and we moved back into the Fredericksburg, Virginia area where we currently live, we began to get in touch with the Spanish-speaking Hispanic Latino community here, and began to see a community that was both under the radar and visible in certain places. A community that was very little understood where we were, a community that was very underserved, a community that that was here, but a lot of people didn't know much about the community. And of course, it was the immigrant Hispanic community. And so as we began to see the community a little bit easier with eyes that were trained a little bit better than when we left the Fredericksburg area in 1987, to be able to see the immigrant community, to see Latinos, Latinas in the market or at Walmart or wherever it might be, and began hearing their stories, began seeing their needs, we realized that this was a community that, yes, had a voice, but they were in need of somebody to come along and walk alongside of them to help them in expressing that voice and giving them the opportunity. And so Lucha Ministries was created out of that because of what our experience was in seeing a community that our larger community really didn't know how to address. They didn't really know in the schools or in the social service agencies, in the hospital, wherever it might be, really how to reach out and connect to and service the Hispanic community primarily, or the immigrant community at large. And so I think that's when I began to really understand the need to be an advocate, to walk alongside, to do what I could to help interpret the reality of the Latino community. One of the things that we began doing when we first started Lucha Ministries, what we called cultural competency conferences, and we were invited. It really came out of an invitation within the community to do it. It wasn't something we created on our own, but it came from an invitation from one of the organizations in the community to come and help them understand who Latinos were, because they wanted to service, but they really didn't understand. And so at the time, it was Sue and me, along with two other partners who were with the United Methodist Church. And he was an associate pastor from born in Mexico. And so the four of us were the ones who put together Lucha Ministry, and we were able to provide that conference, which we did many times after that in different other organizations in the community, just to help them understand a little bit more about the Latino population that was all around. And so I think that's when I began to first realize the need to step into the role of advocacy, to be an advocate, to walk alongside.
Great. Thanks, Greg. Sue, do you have anything you'd add to that?
I think for me, Stephen, probably my first actual formal contact with the concept of advocacy was really in grad school, probably about in 2002, 2003, maybe, when I learned about the issue of dreamers, but we didn't call them dreamers back then. We really didn't know what to call them, but I understood and I learned that there was in Virginia, a bill in the Virginia legislature dealing with kids that didn't have access to go to college or to in-state tuition. And I researched that. I found the representative, the delegate in Virginia that was most passionate about that. We were encouraged in the School of Social Work to choose an issue to follow for over the long haul for at least a year in our studies. And that became my issue. And so we had to actually go to a session and go before a committee and speak on that bill and why it was important and do all of those basics in advocacy. And I think it's really interesting that that was one of the first issues that I was interested in, had to do with higher education for immigrant kids. And that's still one of the issues that we're advocating for here now. Perhaps, almost 18 years later, it's still not solved.
No, sadly not. And I'll just kind of give a commercial and a plug. Yesterday, Andy Hale hosted a CBF conversation with two dreamers, two DACA recipients that are part of a church in Fort Worth. So if you want to hear their story firsthand, go to CBF Conversations or cbf.net/conversation. You can hear more about that. Greg and Sue are both part of what we have called our advocacy action team for immigrants and refugees. And we established that work in early 2017 and focused a lot on DACA and the issues pertaining to those who were brought here as children. In the book, we kind of tell that story. So if you're interested in advocacy and what we've done and to know more about those issues, because they're not solved, then there's a good section in the book about immigration and our team that we've worked and payday lending is also something that's in there, and there's a lot from Scarlett in there as well. So if you're interested in those issues particularly, Greg and Sue have also, and the Angel actually this last year as well, 2 years, have been a part of our Advocacy and Action Conference. So I'll give it one other commercial, and that is every year we have a conference called Advocacy and Action, where we take the time to think deeply about advocacy, about where we find our calling and our motivation for advocacy in the Bible and Scripture. And we have the opportunity to meet other partner organizations who are involved in advocacy, and then make a visit to Capitol Hill. So Sue had that experience you mentioned from her class, but we make sure everyone who goes to Washington with us, usually in March, has that experience. And we've also done it in New York City. We're beginning to work at the UN. So keep an eye out for those. Our hope is this year, maybe right before our General Assembly, which is in Washington, D.C., we'll get to have another in-person event, Lord willing and pandemic willing. So thank you all for that and to kind of telling about your journey there. I want to hear you all speak to maybe our pastors and our churches. We have in CBF Life Encourager churches who have a strong connection with our field personnel. And so missions and our commitment to missions and contributions is really a strong part of CBF Life. And advocacy is sometimes new. So Scarlett, maybe starting with you, for a church or a pastor who is all in on mission work, but maybe hasn't approached to things from an advocacy perspective, do you have any advice or words that you would give them?
Well, I just think that it's our responsibility as the church to be advocates for those whose voice are being oppressed or not being heard, to be able to help them find their voice and to be a voice alongside of them or for them if they're unable, to be heard. So to me, it's biblical. It's part of what we need to do. And each community is different. So look in your community and see where the needs are and what the church needs to be involved in your community. And then, of course, there are, national across the board issues, like the payday lending and immigration and things like that. But, each community is different. Each of my communities is different. My advocacy work in each community is different. So look in your communities and share that with your congregation, because often people are not involved, not because they don't care, but because they don't know. So just sharing and inviting someone to come in and share their story once you build those relationships, because like you've said, when it comes from that person, when it's that personal story, then it has a much larger impact than what I can say. But it's there, it's biblical, and it's part of the church as what our responsibility is.
Thank you, Scar. I think that's especially true in a democracy where our voices and our influence are supposed to matter. And so I think we can't neglect that as Christians, our kind of dual duties there as Christians and citizens. And so thank you. Angel, how about for you? What would you tell a church?
Yeah, I think that as we have seen missions evolve over the decades, right? The youth mission trip used to not be a thing. And then it became a thing and folks did. So I think that the church needs to rise up and lead the way for the next stage of that, which is we love that, for 15 years, I partnered with churches from around the country to come and serve kids in educational programming in the summer at Touching Miami with Love. But now's the time for the churches to say, why are we needed? Why do we need to go down and help kids with their reading in the summer? What's happening in education today that's making this need there? And, that's a deep look at what's going on behind the scenes in public education and how we are continually defunding public education and diverting funds to other things so that our particularly low-income communities of color have public schools that are underfunded with disproportionately high number of students who struggle to learn, whether it's a child with a disability or, not English as their first language, and then say, okay, what can we do to make a difference here? Because it's not that we don't want them to come, but every mission effort should be looking at how do we work ourselves out of a job? How do we improve the community? And Touching Miami with Love is going to continue to love on kids and teach them how to read, but it's going to be a big concerted effort to go up the stream and say, what's going on? What is the struggle for these kids? And you can take that same theory with payday lending, like Scarlett is working for, and she's doing both sides, right? So she's advocating on one hand, and then doing the practical hands-on. And I think that it's the same issue, whether you look at housing, go build a house, but then find out what's happening that, people aren't earning a living wage and can't afford housing in your community. So to me, the call is for the church to lead the way on this next evolution of missions.
Thank you, Angel. That's exactly right. I want to emphasize again, no one is saying there needs to be a choice between the two.
Yeah.
Right. We're continue meeting immediate needs.
Yes. But
Just
when you're
add,
not there, you can still be working on behalf of that community, particularly if it's in your state, because that's where change happens.
Absolutely. I think for too long, there wasn't even the choice of advocacy in our churches, right? It's always mission, which is great, and we should be about that. But I hope that part of what we see in CBF life is that advocacy becomes an avenue for Christian witness, for fulfilling our calling through our churches, through our local congregations, that it's not seen as something other, separate, or optional, right? That there ought to be, just like you can go to a church and get involved in a mission effort, you can go involved in an advocacy effort as well. Sue, we'll start with you this time. What are your words for a congregation or a pastor?
Well, I'm going to use kind of an example from our community that we've seen. I think churches like fairly easy way to plug in to mission or ministry, something that's familiar, something that involves the majority of the congregation. And in our community, that's been done a lot through food and food pantries. And the way advocacy came into play with our local food bank is that as we work with immigrants, specifically Spanish-speaking immigrants, we realized that the foods that they were getting, the needy families were getting from the food bank, weren't always exactly what they needed or what they knew how to cook or were familiar with using. And so we began to go back to the food bank and say, why don't you have more dry beans? And why don't you have larger bags of rice, and things like that our people were needing, that they were familiar, they knew how to make a meal with that. But we tended to be giving them more canned goods and processed foods.
Mhm.
And so we began the advocacy locally with the food bank and saying, can you add these products? And pretty soon those appeared on their priority list as they were sending out to churches and to other groups who were collecting food. And so then we took it one step farther and began to educate many of the other folks in the other food pantries about the need of providing foods that refugees and immigrants were more familiar with. Not because they won't eat it or they don't like it, but really it's more empowering when you give someone, and it shows appreciation of their language and their culture when they can actually read a label and know what they're getting. And when they're given all of the supplies and the ingredients to cook a meal that they actually know how to cook, and they feel better about themselves and they feel better about caring for their families when they do that. So I would encourage churches to look around again at their own community, as I believe Scarlett said, and see who's there. What are the needs in your local community, and how can you improve upon the mission and ministry that you're already engaged in with what you already know? How can you do it better, and how can you do it so that everybody's not doing the same exact thing for this same little group of people? And it's all not charity. It's very empowering. It's very uplifting and encourages people in new and different ways. And it really doesn't take a lot of work. It just really thinking outside the box a little bit for churches and asking the right questions of others who are involved with the marginalized within their communities.
That's a great point, Sue. I'll say a few things about that before we go to Greg. One, that last thing you said, I often encourage people to ask more questions in their mission work. Try and get to the root. Maybe sometimes it's happened a lot when it comes to predatory lending, where someone comes in and says, "I need help with a light bill or rent or whatever," and you can just hand them the money, and that's good. That's benevolence, and that's helpful for the moment. But if you don't ask what's going on, why, sometimes you don't realize that they're always going to need more money as long as they're stuck paying a payday loan. So ask more questions. I think that's a great point you made, Sue. And then I also want to say, not the target of advocacy is not always a legislative body. Right? Sometimes you need the culture to change or a business practice to change. In your case, a food pantry to change their practice, and that needs to be thought of and embraced as advocacy as well. There's sort of a joke I heard in legislative circles that says you can change a state law, or you can just get Walmart to change its practices. They're going to have that big of an impact, right? I mean, that's kind of an extreme example, but if you get sometimes it is not necessarily a new law. It's encouraging folks to change practices. And then, finally, you mentioned hunger and food pantry type ministries. That's exactly the kind of thing we want folks to take a look at. A lot of our churches are involved in feeding the hungry, and then say, okay, what does this look like from an advocacy standpoint? And so I would encourage folks to look at Bread for the World, a good, strong partner for us. They're going to know about SNAP benefits. What's going on? Why has they gone down? Or what about summer feeding? What's the meal situation in the public school? And so do that kind of missions assessment, and then put an advocacy lens on it. And then look for partners and experts around who will know more about it. So that's a great example. Greg, what are your words for a church or a congregation?
One of the words that's been popular in mission circles for many years that mission practitioners, strategists, and others use to talk about how best mission is accomplished is mission being incarnational, taking on the flesh of the community, of the people that you are ministering among. And I think that for churches that are involved in mission, I think churches, if they can learn to take on the flesh of that community, to listen to the stories, to get to the root problems, to ask the questions, as you say, I think that mission is more successful, and I think that the church becomes an advocate for that community as they take on the flesh of that community. Become like the community as much as possible. Try to understand where the community is coming from. That's that's really been the only way that we've been able to do mission in Fredericksburg. And it's allowed us to become advocates as we've tried to understand what some of the root causes were and are for the fact that the immigrant community is often seen the way that they are, or that they have the particular needs that they have. You have to kind of, as much as possible, become like them and hear them and listen to them. And so that's where I see where mission and advocacy intersect, is both mission and advocacy done right immerses themselves in the context that they're in.
Thanks, Greg. That's wonderful advice. So we're about 10 minutes to the hour, and I knew this would go fast with you all. But I would love a word, kind of more immediate word. What are some of the things that your folks, your community is facing right now? Maybe one or two issues that people need to be aware of, and maybe if you have an action step, something they can do, that would be helpful as well. We'll go to Angel this time. We'll flip up the rotation a little bit. So Angel, what do you see?
Yeah, so I would just encourage folks to love on teachers. There is no one pulled in more direction as the country has now moved from the online digital learning to this hybrid. The teachers I talk to, many are teaching to a live audience and virtual students as well. And just the stress that puts on them. So I say, whether you have a child in school or not, find a way to love on teachers. And so we did do a CBF conversation of supporting education in the time of COVID. You can go back and watch that. But there are tremendous ideas that churches and individuals are doing to support teachers right now. Because if we don't have teachers healthy and whole and, in a good mind, then that is automatically going to translate to how they teach. I was a classroom teacher for years in, a very healthy environment. And I know that life changes in my life affected how I brought myself to teaching. And so I think that churches especially need to make a concerted effort to support teachers, because by doing that, you're supporting students. And then, of course, there are always the needs of any at-risk or hurting community that can be, can be beneficial. But from my stance, that's what I would encourage folks to do.
Thanks, Angel. Scarlett?
I definitely gonna second that with Angel. I work closely with my schools, and let me add into their your family resource center coordinators if you have those in your schools, because they are frontline essential workers. They are going into the schools and ministering to those students and families that are struggling, and I work closely with them, and I know what they're going through. But also, I'm seeing really an upscale in mental health issues, depression, anxiety, divorce. So I have been doing a lot more ministry in kind of pastoral care. So, folks that already maybe struggle with depression and anxiety, that is intensified. And then those that are isolated already, that is intensified. So I think just as a whole, we need to be aware of mental health issues in our adults as well as our children. So that's another way to keep those teachers in prayer and also in mind, because they are going to have a lot of interaction with their students, whether in the classroom or online. So to me, just aside from the physical basic needs that folks are struggling with now, I'm seeing a lot of mental health issues and an increase in addiction issues.
Thanks for letting us know, Scarlett. Greg, what do you think?
I want to make a practical, personal challenge to all of us, and that is, I challenge us to learn to read the Bible through immigrant eyes. To read the Bible as if we were migrants on the move, whose stories out of those Bibles would resonate with us. Whose lives out of the Bible would resonate with us? To discover that the Bible, that our biblical ancestors were very much, many of them, people on the move, people who moved from one place to another, or people who had to move, had to escape for different reasons. So I think if we could learn to read the Bible through immigrant eyes, we would have a greater appreciation for refugees, asylees, other immigrants in our community, people from around the world who find themselves in situations that they never chose, would not have chosen, but they are forced to leave a settled life for an unsettled life. Those of us who live settled lives, it's very hard for us to understand that world. We have to intentionally understand that world. So I challenge us to read the Bible that way.
Thank you, Greg. Sue, how about you? What's something immediate?
I'm going to return to the topic of education, and because I think for immigrant families, for kids who come from homes where parents don't speak English, this is a really particularly hard time for them, especially if they're doing online learning or remote learning, because the parents really don't have the language to be able to help their kids. And the kids may be fine on the computers and getting on and doing their classes, but the parents are out of the loop, and they really need to be in that loop. And then for some kids that are recently arrived that don't speak English very well, they're getting farther and farther behind. And so the educational gap is really big right now between immigrant and refugee kids and just the regular population. They're not generally from technologically literate families, and giving them a computer is not the answer. They may not even know how to turn it on. So I would say churches could support those immigrant families in their communities, work with your local ESOL teacher in your school system, identify some kids that need some help, special help to keep from getting farther behind, but education.
Thank you, Sue. There's no doubt that this now long and drawn out pandemic season has exacerbated a lot of the challenges we see, and then sometimes made response even more challenging. And so I appreciate you all's advice, and particularly thinking about how this situation has made things tougher for folks. We're about at the end of our time here. I could go another hour with y'all easily, but I don't think that's what we're going to be able to do. Thank you all so much for your time today, for being with us, for sharing your story, and obviously for the ministry you do at CBF Field Personnel. We have incredible field personnel, and you all are great examples of that. So thank you all.
Thank you, Stephen, for
you.
Well, I can't conclude without at least mentioning the fact that there's an election coming up, and so I would say my advice is first vote. We can certainly advocate for voting. Everybody on this that's seeing this video needs to go out and vote, and get your friends and family to do this, to vote as well. And then that's the first step in advocacy. Then engage in advocacy more fully. So thank you all so much for your time. Thanks everyone for joining us online. I hope this has been helpful. You can look for more resources from CBF Advocacy for you and your church. Everyone have a great afternoon. Thank you.